The subcommittee will now come to order. The chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes for the purpose of an opening statement. So welcome to the Environment, Manufacturing, and Critical Materials Subcommittee's markup of 3 bills to preserve Americans' access to affordable, reliable, and secure vehicles and fuels. Less than 3 weeks ago, this subcommittee held a legislative hearing on the legislation being marked up today. We heard testimony from Joe Goffman, Principal Deputy Administrator of the EPA's Office of Air and Radiation, who, in my view, struggled to justify the Biden administration's rush to rapidly electrify America's vehicles. We also heard from key stakeholders, including the presidents of American fuel and petrochemical manufacturers and the Minnesota Auto Dealers Association, who voiced strong support for the legislation on our agenda today. AFPM President Thompson warned us that without legislation to curb these abuses, the Biden EPA's policies would directly benefit our global adversaries. Why? Well, for example, China dominates the global supply chain for EVs by controlling 80% of lithium refining. They control half of all cobalt production. They control nearly 100% of refining and processing of critical minerals. And now, on top of that, they're cornering the global market on oil refining as we're shutting ours down. We need to pump the brakes on the Biden administration's policies and regulations that essentially mandate EVs on an irresponsible rush to green timeline. This administration is undermining our national security and taking away choice from American consumers in what appears to be an attempt to essentially nationalize major sectors of our transportation industry. And closer to home, our witness from the Minnesota Auto Dealers, Mr. Lambert, highlighted that electric vehicles simply do not work for many Americans. Specifically, he explained that EVs lose 40% of their battery capacity in cold temperatures, dramatically decrease in range when towing any load. He pointed out that a lack of dependable charging infrastructure that urban and rural Americans can access, and these EVs come at a much higher price than their gas and diesel-powered counterparts. In other words, if you use your pickup truck for work, EVs won't work for you. So to preserve the choice in vehicles Americans prefer and can afford, Republicans have solutions, and we're marking those up here today. First, from Representatives Joyce, Latta, Bilirakis, and Obernolte, their bill would limit the EPA's ability to issue California a waiver of national vehicle emission standards if the state's policies directly or indirectly limit the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles. The EPA should not use the misguided standards of one state as justification to drive vehicles that the agency does not like off the road. Next, we have the No Fuel Credits for Batteries Act introduced by Mr. Pence. The bill addresses the EPA's disastrous efforts to simply make up the legal authority needed to introduce electricity into the renewable fuel standard. After heavy criticism, including from this committee, the EPA itself decided not to move forward with the ERIN's proposal, quote, at this time. However, the EPA announced plans to continue working on an ERIN's program that could be finalized at a later date. So to prevent any future agency overreach, this bill clarifies that EPA is not authorized to create an ERIN's program. In addition, we're marking up the Choice in Automobile Retail Sales Act, or the CARS Act, introduced by Mr. Walberg. The bill would prevent the EPA from implementing the multi-pollutant emission standards for model years 2027 and later for light and medium-duty vehicles, which requires 2/3 of their new car sales, of new car sales and half of new truck sales to be electric by 2032. The bill also prevents EPA from issuing regulations in the future that would mandate the use of one vehicle technology or limit the availability of vehicles based on engine type. And I'll be entering an article into the record today, an article from just this past Monday from Axios entitled, unsold electric cars are piling up on dealer lots. It details that in many cases, EVs are currently sitting at dealers twice as long as hybrid and gas-powered models. My friends, it's clear that the American people are not sold on this rush to EV agenda. We must prevent the Biden administration from imposing EV mandates that do not align with consumer preferences, occur at a pace and scale that would directly increase costs for working Americans, and that would undermine our national security, all for very questionable environmental gain. Today's markup is a key step towards protecting consumer choice in transportation. I look forward to advancing the three bills on our agenda today, and I yield back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tomko, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. For many years, we have heard Republicans on this committee talk about the need for innovation to address our pollution challenges. And today, we are at the beginning of a technology revolution in the transportation sector. Zero-emission vehicles are becoming increasingly cost competitive, increasingly available with all different makes and models and price points, and increasingly in demand by American consumers. People realize that zero-emission vehicles have the ability to meet the overwhelming majority of their driving needs today while saving them thousands of dollars in fuel and maintenance costs over the life of the vehicle. This all sounds pretty great, and that is even before acknowledging that these vehicles will drastically reduce harmful climate and traditional pollutants. And thanks to the investments included in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, the manufacturing supply chains for these vehicles, their batteries, and their charging equipment are increasingly being built here in the United States, creating jobs and enabling the U.S. to retain the mantle of the greatest auto manufacturing country in the world for another generation. That is what innovation looks like, and that innovation, like most innovation, is being driven by a mix of consumer trends, financial incentives, and regulatory policies. Unfortunately, the Republican majority wants to stifle America's next great industrial revolution before we even get into the race with China and dozens of other foreign competitors. And the three bills before us today are just the latest examples of the majority not only trying to undermine market trends, but to prevent the EPA from carrying out its mission to protect human health and our environment. EPA has a responsibility to protect Americans from harmful air pollution, and the transportation sector is the largest contributor to the U.S. climate pollution, as well as a major source of other dangerous pollutants. As we know, EPA recently proposed new tailpipe standards for light-duty vehicles for model years 2027 through 2032. In fact, the comment period ended just last week. But H.R. 4468, the Choice in Automobile Retail Sales Act of 2023, seeks to prejudge the outcome of that process and prohibit EPA from finalizing its rule. The majority does not seem to care that the proposed rule will save lives, save consumers money, and bolster our American manufacturing. Similarly, H.R. 1435, the Preserving Choice in Vehicle Purchases Act, would restrict EPA from allowing California to set more protective vehicle emission standards to address its extraordinary pollution challenges. This bill not only infringes on California's ability to protect its citizens from dangerous air pollution, but also the rights of more than a dozen other states, including New York, that opt to follow California rules. And finally, H.R. 4469, the No Fuel Credits for Batteries Act of 2023, prohibits EPA from moving forward with eRINs under the Renewable Fuel Standard Program. As we heard from EPA during this legislative hearing, the Clean Air Act does not say that transportation fuels must be liquid fuels. And in order to qualify for credits under the RFS, the electricity would still need to be generated from eligible feedstocks. Prohibiting EPA from moving forward with eRINs will continue to limit and in some cases prevent wastewater plants and landfills that capture biogas from participating in the RFS. The RFS should seek to keep up with innovations in transportation, and that means continuing to incentivize all eligible renewable fuels, not a specific type of vehicle technology. As I said at the legislative hearing, these bills seek to create uncertainty for the private sector, disrupting the tens of billions of dollars of planned investments to to develop and produce the next generation of clean vehicle technologies. Instead, we should embrace this opportunity to lead the world in cleaner, more efficient vehicles. It is going to create jobs, reduce pollution, and save lives. In fact, it is already doing so. I urge members to oppose the three bills before us today, and for all of us to move forward with an eye toward how we can make certain all of our constituents are better able to benefit from the ongoing transportation revolution. With that, I thank you, Mr. Chair, and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Chair Rogers, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the Detroit Auto Show, President Biden said he believes America can own the future of the automobile market. Unfortunately, by using the EPA to institute government mandates and restrictions, he is handing the keys of America's auto future to China. The bills before us today are a response to those efforts. We're offering a different approach, one that builds on a century of success rather than ignoring it. We want to secure America's future, the American way, through enterprise, free enterprise, and innovation. We want Americans to continue to have the ability to choose the best transportation options for their lives. EPA wants to eliminate that choice by mandating nearly 70% of new vehicles be 100% battery electric by 2032. That's not how we win the future. We win the future by innovating, building in America, letting people choose the cars they want to drive, whether they are the most energy efficient internal combustion engine vehicles, hybrid plug-in, hybrid hydrogen, electric vehicles, or maybe something yet to be created. That's the American way. And that's how we ensure that we will continue to lead. America, not China, should be leading in auto manufacturing. Now, in 2007, China made a decision to electrify its economy and its transportation sector because it benefited them economically and geopolitically. We know that China's not focused on reducing carbon emissions, so don't be fooled. And since 2007, their emissions have increased by 60%. Today, China's building on average 2 coal-fired plants every week to meet their goal, their goal of electrification. China dominates access to critical minerals. It controls 76% of global battery cell production capacity for these electric vehicles, around 75% of all lithium-ion batteries, and the majority of processing and refining capacity for over half of the world's lithium, cobalt, and graphite. Last quarter, China became the largest exporter of new motor vehicles, EVs, in the world, surpassing Japan. Forcing Americans to switch to EVs plays right into China's hands. For example, China's now building EV manufacturing plants, car manufacturing plants in Mexico. Chinese EV companies are expanding their foothold in Europe. We've seen the real dangers of ceding our energy leadership to China and being overly reliant on our adversaries. Why would we want our dependency for cars on China also? So now later this month, John Kerry is going to be traveling to China to resume the administration's climate talks. I'm increasingly concerned that given this administration's record to date, these negotiations are prioritizing China's interests over our own, further ceding America's energy and automobile leadership to China with some of the worst environmental and labor standards in the world. Instead of building on America's century of automobile leadership, the Biden administration is implementing top-down government mandates that are going to drive up costs, stifle innovation, limit people's choice, and benefit China directly. Now, I've heard some of my colleagues, Democrat colleagues, and our current Secretary of Energy state that we need to follow China's lead. That is not the future that Americans want. We, in the United States of America, should be leading. Our goal is to increase, not limit, America's choices for the vehicles that they drive and the fuel that they use. Electric vehicles account for 4% of the cars on the road in California, and their grid can't handle the increase in electricity usage. Governor Newsom has asked residents on multiple occasions to refrain from charging their cars in order to ration energy. My home state of Washington is joining California in the effort to ban all cars except 100% battery electric vehicles. probably made by China car companies. And now we have the highest gas prices in the nation. Clearly, it's not sustainable. Yet President Biden and the EPA want to force the entire country to follow California's suit. And that's why I encourage every member to join our bills today, which will prevent California from dictating the cars people drive and the fuels that they use. Our legislative solutions are about making life more affordable and not ceding American auto leadership to China, ensuring that our constituents have access to affordable, reliable, functional means of transportation. That should be a bipartisan goal. We cannot win the future with China making our cars and the federal government dictating what we drive. And we cannot win the future by sending American auto jobs overseas to China. We need to stay focused on the real goal. And the real goal is continued American leadership in the auto sector while being good stewards of the environment. We've been doing this for decades, and we've led. We're leading the world in bringing down carbon emissions. Let's continue to lead and win the future. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Representative Pallone, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week was the hottest week ever recorded. Incidents of drought, wildfires, hurricanes, and extreme heat continue to rise across the country. The effects of these weather events are being felt by our constituents and are costing our nation hundreds of billions of dollars every year. The climate crisis is here, and we must address it while also growing our economy for the future by investing in a clean energy economy. The transportation sector is a significant contributor to climate pollution with detrimental impacts on public health and the environment. Decades of ambitious clean vehicle standards have driven historic innovation, delivering cleaner air and better technologies, and positioning the United States as a global leader in cleaner transportation. We must continue to drive that progress. House Democrats delivered real solutions for cleaner transportation last Congress by passing 2 historic laws. The bipartisan infrastructure law invested in EV charging, clean transportation, and EV battery components, including critical minerals which have increasingly been manufactured overseas. These investments will help build the EV infrastructure needed across the nation. The Inflation Reduction Act included rebates and tax credits to lower the cost of electric vehicles for American families, including a tax credit up to $4,000 for a qualifying pre-owned or used electric vehicle. Electric vehicles are becoming more and more popular every day, and these tax credits are making them even more affordable for American families. And yet every Republican here today voted against both of these laws and all of these critical investments. The Republican agenda is focused on propping up big oil corporations while undermining common sense protections from harmful air pollution and attempting to reverse hard-fought climate progress. The Republicans would rather continue doing the bidding of their big corporate friends to the detriment of growing our economy for the future and helping to lower costs for American families. Today's markup is no different. The bills on today's agenda are anti-science, anti-innovation, and anti-progress. They will move us backwards in our efforts of cleaning up and modernizing the transportation sector and would stymie efforts to fight climate change and protect public health and the environment. H.R. 1435, the Preserving Choice in Automobile Sales Act, would turn back over 50 years of recognizing California's authority to set more protective vehicle emission standards. It infringes on the rights of states, like my home state of New Jersey, to voluntarily adopt those standards to protect people from dangerous air pollution. At the legislative hearing, the only witness representing any vehicle manufacturers testified that this bill would cause significant disruption and uncertainty in the U.S. vehicle market, which would hurt our global leadership and consumer access to EV choices. Then there's H.R. 4468, the Choice in Automobile Retail Sales Act. That would bar the EPA from finalizing its light and medium-duty vehicle emission standards for model year 2027. This bill also jeopardizes EPA's ability to finalize new vehicle emission standards, effectively preventing the agency from fulfilling its obligation to protect Americans from motor vehicle pollution. And finally, there's H.R. 4469, the No Fuel for Batteries Act. That would block EPA from allowing credits to be generated under the renewable fuel standard for renewable electricity for transportation fuel, also known as eRINs. EPA has been working on this since 2010, following the direction of Congress. The bill would block eRINs produced by renewable biogas feedstocks such as farmers, landfills, and municipal wastewater treatment facilities from actively participating in the RFS and would hamper biofuel opportunities across the country. All three of these bills show how Republicans are willing to sacrifice Americans' rights to clean air and a safe climate. They also show Republicans are willing to abandon American innovation and global leadership in order to support corporations. Reversing our progress on clean transportation and doubling down on fossil fuel dependence would make the United States weaker, not stronger for the future. We already have the technology and the ingenuity to be the global leader in clean transportation, lowering energy costs, protecting public health, fighting the climate crisis, and strengthening our economy in the process. But the three bills before us today would abandon our position in favor of maintaining the status quo of putting polluters over people. So for these reasons, I oppose all three of these bills, Mr. Chairman, and urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to do the same. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair reminds members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. Are there further opening statements? Seeing none, the chair now calls up H.R. 1435 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 1435, a bill to amend the Clean Air Act to prevent the elimination of the sale of internal combustion engines.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there other amendments?
Speak on the underlying bill.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word to speak in opposition to H.R. 1435.
You're speaking in opposition to the underlying bill?
Yes.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. While this bill is called the Preserving Choice in Vehicle Purchases Act, it will actually accomplish the opposite. If enacted, this bill would take away freedom of choice from all states, but especially those actively working to address dangerous air pollution from the transportation sector. By making such egregious changes to the Clean Air Act Section 209 waiver authority, this bill directly infringes on states' rights to make regulatory decisions that fit their needs. This proposal would not only imperil California's statutorily granted ability to seek waivers for more protective standards, but it would significantly hamper the rights of any state that chooses to follow California's lead. Under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act, states may voluntarily adopt any California vehicle emissions standard that has been granted a waiver from EPA. My home state of New York is one of those states, and I can tell you that my constituents would not accept Congress taking away the right to address air pollution. No one is forcing states to adopt California standards, but for many parts of the country, this path makes a lot of sense. This bill encroaches upon the rights of states that choose to follow California's lead on vehicle emission standards and is a blatant attack on states that are taking ambitious steps forward to curb air pollution on their home turf. I would expect my Republican colleagues to protect states' rights. With that, I urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Joyce for 5 minutes to speak on behalf of his bill.
First, I want to thank you, Chairman Johnston, for holding this markup on these three critical bills that specifically deal with the automotive industry. Mobility is essential to our American way of life. Our culture, our economy are built around Americans having to be able to be reliable and affordable forms of transportation. Now, government overreach is threatening to put cars, SUVs, and trucks that hardworking Americans need out of their reach. One of the clearest and most draconian actions taken by liberal activists is California's new Advanced Clean Cars 2. These regulations would require 35% of new car sales to be EVs in 2026 and fully all 100% of sales to be EVs by 2035. The only thing standing in the way of these regulations going into effect is the required waiver from the EPA under the Clean Air Act. That is why I, along with Representatives Latta, Bilirakis, and Obernolte, introduced H.R. 1435, the Preserving Choice in Vehicle Purchase Act, to prevent the EPA administrator from granting a waiver allowing California's ban on internal combustion engine sales by 2035. Although starting in California, Section 177 of the Clean Air Act will ensure that once adopted, these regulations will spread across the nation, disrupting the entire American automobile market and ultimately limit what my constituents are able to buy. 17 states, including my home state of Pennsylvania, have already adopted California's clean air regulations. These states represent over 40% of the American automobile market, and any electric vehicle mandate on that large of a scale is a de facto mandate on the entire market and represents a decisive shift in national policy. Let's put it bluntly. In my district, EVs cannot fulfill the needs of my constituents and their families. EVs can't drive the necessary distance needed. They can't maintain the charge at extreme temperatures or recharge fast enough to keep hard-working Pennsylvanians on the move. 3 weeks ago, we heard testimony in this subcommittee from Scott Lambert, the president of the Minnesota Auto Dealers Association. His position was clear. The auto dealers are not anti-electric car. Far from it. In places like St. Paul and Minneapolis, where there is a market for EVs, they're happy to sell them. But many characteristics shared by Minnesota and Pennsylvania make a 100% EV adoption simply impossible. The cold winters, the mountainous terrains of states like these require Americans to have reliable and capable vehicles. That is why 89% of auto sales in Minnesota were pickup trucks and SUVs. To strip constituents of that choice is government overreach at its worst. I am encouraged, though, that in their testimony to this committee, Biden administrative officials appear to recognize this fact. On May 10th, I asked EPA Administrator Regan if he supported banning the internal combustion engine, and he responded, and I quote, "Not at all." When I asked if he supported consumer choice in vehicles, his response was, quote, "I don't see a near-term future where we don't have a fuel supply that complements electric vehicles and provides customer choice." That's what this legislation is about. Posing the same question on June 22nd to Joseph Gottman, the Principal Deputy Administrator for the EPA's Office of Air and Radiation, he reiterated the commitment not to support a ban on internal combustion engines. Given the policy stance taken by these administrative officials, this bill should have an opportunity to work together in a bipartisan fashion. As I have made clear before in this committee, H.R. 1435 is not anti-electric vehicle. Those who can afford, those who would like an electric vehicle should be able to buy one, but it does not help constituents in any of our districts to require them to buy EVs regardless of their needs or their wants. An EV mandate is an abandonment of the free market principles that have enabled Americans to have the most mobility of any nation in the world. It would have horrible effects on our nation's refining capacity and Americans' energy independence. It would destabilize the grid by adding demand at a pace that our infrastructure and electric generation cannot keep up with. Lastly, this policy would harm working and middle-class families by making cars less capable and thousands of dollars more expensive for the people who can least afford it. Only by taking government's thumb off of the scale and letting the free market decide will Americans get the efficient and affordable transportation that they need. I urge all of my colleagues to support this important H.R. 1435 legislation. Thank you, Chairman Johnson, for holding this markup today, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do other members wish to speak on the bill? Gentleman from California is recognized, Mr. Peters.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word and speak in opposition to H.R. 1435. My Republican colleagues like to attack California for its forward-thinking policies, to address dangerous air pollution, especially from the transportation sector. California has been a leader in reducing air pollution for decades because of our unique pollution challenges. In fact, California was the very first state to regulate tailpipe pollution from vehicles. The federal government followed California's lead by enacting the first iteration of the Clean Air Act in 1970, over 10 years after California enacted legislation to adopt standards for community air quality and motor vehicle emissions. And since California already had tailpipe emission standards on the books in 1966 under Governor Ronald Reagan, Congress drafted the Clean Air Act to accommodate their ongoing innovation and progress in addressing air pollution from the transportation sector. Section 209 of the Clean Air Act, which this poorly drafted bill would amend, requires EPA to grant California waivers so it can set vehicle emission standards that are stricter than those set by EPA at the federal level. Over the years, EPA has granted California dozens of waivers for its emission standards. This has enabled California not only to address its significant air pollution challenges, but has also cemented California as a leader in driving emissions reduction technologies. California's ambitious standards paved the way for the invention of the catalytic converter and the dashboard check engine lights, in addition to development of zero-emission vehicles. Now, H.R. 1435 seeks to erase decades of historic progress on addressing air pollution, driving innovation, and protecting public health. And frankly, the goal of this short-sighted bill might be to keep us stuck in the past, keep our heads in the sand, while the real tangible dangers of climate change continue to affect our communities, our environment, and our economy. So we should not reverse decades of California's historic leadership in protecting public health and addressing air pollution from the transportation sector. I urge my colleagues to vote no on H.R. 1435, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Obernolte for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am proud to express my support for H.R. 1435, the Preserving Choice in Vehicles Purchase Act, a bill that I was very pleased to introduce alongside my colleagues, Representative Joyce Latta and Bill Arakis. Obviously, I represent my home state of California. I have worked for many years with the California Air Resources Board. Let me tell you why I am so thoroughly convinced that allowing CARB to ban the sale of internal combustion vehicles by 2035 is a terrible idea, not only for California, but for the rest of the country. I represent over 100,000 people who commute long distances from my district back and forth to Los Angeles every day. And folks, they're not doing that because they want to and they enjoy driving for 2 hours a day. They're doing that because that's what's required to put food on the table for their families. They factor those choices in when they decide what kind of a vehicle to purchase. And right now, they're not buying electric vehicles. We have to ask ourselves as a society and a government why that is. Right now, unsold inventory of electric vehicles is almost twice as high across the country as internal combustion engine vehicles. So these are a choice, even with the subsidized purchase price of electric vehicles today, this is a choice that consumers are already rejecting. So the first problem is that electric vehicles are substantially more expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles, even with a subsidized purchase price. And obviously, if California completely bans the sale of internal combustion engines and requires all vehicles to be electric, they're not all going to be subsidized. So this problem is going to get even worse. Also, there's the problem of operating costs. Obviously, you don't have to buy fuel for an electric vehicle, but you do have to pay for the electricity it takes to charge the battery. And that electricity for my constituents is becoming more and more expensive and less affordable. In my own hometown, the electric provider recently submitted a rate case to the California Public Utilities Commission seeking permission to boost the base rate for residential electricity up over 40 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's the base rate, and that's this year, not 2035. Just try to make a financial case for owning an electric vehicle if you have to pay 40 cents a kilowatt hour to charge it. I've done the math. I can tell you it absolutely does not work, and that's going to be worse for my constituents 12 years from now than it is today. Now, to be clear, none of us are anti-electric vehicle, but we are very much in favor of allowing consumers to make their own choices when it comes to deciding what vehicles they're going to purchase for themselves and for their households. That's what H.R. 1435 preserves, is the freedom for our constituents to choose the vehicle that works best for them. So I urge my colleagues to support this very meaningful legislation and to move us forward in not only making the earth greener, but also making our country a freer place for the people that we represent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman, or the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk, amendment number 1.
The clerk will report.
Amendment to H.R. 1435, offered by Mr. Ruiz. Beginning on page 2, strike line 24 and all that follows through page...
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. H.R. 1435, the Preserving Choice in Vehicles Purchasing Act, would prevent the EPA administrator from granting a waiver of federal preemption under the Clean Air Act. These waivers have allowed states to set their own emission standards to address pollution without waiting for federal guidance. That is why this bill is a direct attack, for example, on my home state of California for proactively addressing a major public health concern, poor air quality. In a recent report by the American Lung Association titled, quote, Driving to Clean Air, found that we could prevent 89,300 fewer premature deaths by moving to 100% zero emissions. Additionally, this will lead to 2.2 million fewer asthma attacks and $978 billion in public health benefits overall by cleaning up our air. California has uniquely difficult air quality challenges. It's got the largest population, which is why my home state has taken a leading role in pollution controls for vehicles. This revocation could cover California waivers from 2017 to 2025 standards, the ACC ZEV mandate, the ACC tailpipe emissions, and the Act I, all of those which would be detrimental. Considering that these waivers have already been granted, and for the past 50 years, both Congress and the EPA have recognized California's authority to set more protective vehicle emission standards, this specific section of the bill infringes on California's rights. The Preserving Choice in Vehicles Purchases Act would have detrimental impacts on the EPA's long-standing authority to grant waivers to states. The quote-unquote California waiver has been essential for states wishing to take proactive steps to improve their air quality and environments. We should encourage states to act proactively, not retroactively punishing states for addressing public health concerns. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes on my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back, and with that, the chair has been informed that votes have been called with this new, now to be enforced rule of 20 minutes. We've got to get to the floor, so the subcommittee stands in recess. We will convene for discussion on this amendment after votes. The subcommittee will come to order. As a reminder, we left off with Mr. Ruiz having spoken in support of his amendment number 1. Is there discussion of the amendment? The chair now recognizes Dr. Joyce for 5 minutes.
I would like to strike the last word to speak in opposition to this amendment.
Gentleman's recognized.
This amendment would strip the portion of the bill that requires the EPA administrator to revoke a waiver that bans internal combustion engines. The Biden administration could decide to approve a waiver for California regulations before this bill is passed into law. And without this piece of the bill, the administration would be able to circumvent the will of Congress and say that their hands are tied, since they've already granted that waiver. This amendment further would strip from H.R. 1435 the portion of the bill that is critical to ensuring that a ban on internal combustion vehicles would remain in place. This amendment undermines the purpose of the bill and is a tactic to eliminate its effectiveness. Simply, I urge all of my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. Thank you, and I yield, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Is any other discussion? Gentleman from New York is
Yes.
recognized. Mr. Tonko.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word and speak in support of Congressman Ruiz's amendment.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, sir. While I oppose this bill in its entirety, this amendment focuses on a particularly egregious section. This amendment strikes language that would force EPA to go back and revoke all waivers granted after January 1st of 2022. This is an incredibly irresponsible way to regulate. Jumping back and forth between approving and revoking waivers would cause uncertainty for industry, which would have a disastrous ripple effect on the entire vehicle market. At our legislative hearing last month, we heard from stakeholders about concerns with this bill. The only witness who represented any vehicle manufacturers testified that this bill would create substantial disruption for the United States vehicle market. In addition to disrupting the vehicle market in California, this bill's detrimental impacts would extend to any state that adopts California's standards under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act. These states represent more than 40% of new vehicle sales. The witness explained that members of the EV ecosystem, including vehicle manufacturers and their complex supply chains, make decisions and investments based on current regulatory regimes. Throwing a wrench into how EPA and states can regulate dangerous air pollution from vehicles would only weaken our domestic vehicle market and imperil ongoing investments. My Republican colleagues are so anti-EV that they are willing to risk the health and future of our entire domestic EV market. Picking winners and picking losers by derailing longstanding precedent is irresponsible, and our constituents deserve better. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? If there is no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay.
Mr. Chair,
Nay.
Mr. Chair, can I ask for a recorded vote, please?
The nays have it, but a recorded vote has been called. The clerk will report.
Carter. Palmer. Crenshaw. Crenshaw votes no. Joyce. Joyce votes no. Weber. Allen. Balderson. Balderson votes no. Fulcher. Fulcher votes no. Pfluger. Pfluger votes no. Miller Meeks. Miller Meeks votes no. Obernolte. Obernolte votes no. Rogers. Rogers votes no. Johnson.
No.
Johnson votes no. Tonko.
Aye.
Tonkin votes aye. Deget. Schakowsky. Schakowsky votes aye. Sarbanes. Clark. Clark votes aye. Ruiz. Ruiz votes aye. Peters. Barragan. Barragan votes aye. Pallone. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Palmer's not recorded. Palmer votes no. Mr. Weber is not recorded. Weber votes no. DeGette is not recorded. DeGette votes aye. Carter is not recorded. Carter votes no. Chair Johnson, on that vote, there were 7 ayes and 12 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments? For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk labeled SC03.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1435, offered by Ms. Badagan. At the end of the following,
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My amendment prevents this bill, H.R. 1435, from going into effect unless the Director of the Environmental Protection Agency determines it will not harm the public health of environmental justice communities. The Clean Air Act waiver allows California to adopt stronger vehicle emission standards than the federal government. This waiver authority recognizes the significant air quality challenges that harm the health of our residents. The concentration of pollution from vehicles and trucks is intense in environmental justice communities. Residents in these areas have higher rates of cancer and respiratory ailments like asthma. Too many kids have asthma inhalers around their necks. This bill attacks California's ability to protect its residents from air pollution. It will also hurt residents in other states that have adopted California's vehicle standards. This Republican effort to block innovation is a road to nowhere. The vehicle manufacturers have figured this out. Last week, California and truck manufacturers announced the Clean Truck Partnership, which commits the truck industry to follow our zero emissions rules for trucks. In addition, major American automakers like Ford and General Motors have goals to sell at least 50% electric vehicles by 2030. They came to the realization that it's better to embrace the future of transportation than try to hold it back. This is critical for the health of all communities, including communities of color and low-income communities in my district and those across the country that are hit hardest by air pollution from vehicles. This pollution makes the air unsafe to breathe in our communities. It worsens the climate crisis. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment to make sure this bill will not go into effect if it harms the health of environmental justice communities. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there discussion on the amendment? The chair recognizes Dr. Joyce.
I would like to strike the last word to speak in opposition to the amendment, Mr. Chair.
Dr. Joyce is recognized for 5 minutes.
This amendment would require the EPA to certify that this act would not disproportionately harm the public health, environmental justice communities before it was implemented. It's an amendment that is incredibly short-sighted and ill-conceived. An internal combustion ban will disproportionately harm the very communities that this amendment attempts to protect. The rural and urban poor will be forced into buying less reliable cars at prices that they cannot afford, or struggling families will have to purchase used cars with internal combustion engines at exorbitant prices. It couldn't be clearer that an EV mandate would be an economic attack on the most disadvantaged communities in all of our districts. It's time to get out of the DC bubble and truly understand how these policies will affect our constituents. I urge all to vote no on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Is there other discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
For what purposes, gentleman from?
Move the strike last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania for introducing this bill, and I'm proud to co-sponsor it. This bill, along with Mr. Wahlberg's bill, are crucial to stopping the war against the American consumer's ability to choose what vehicle they want to drive. The combined effect of California's waiver request and EPA's emission standards is a de facto EV mandate that is entirely inappropriate. The federal government is not in the business of dictating consumer choice, especially when it can be so detrimental to the lives of Americans from all walks of life. Portions of my district are incredibly rural and simply not practical for EVs. My constituents deserve access to affordable vehicles they can depend on. I understand that my colleagues across the aisle are big fans of EVs. I get it. They are very high-tech and can be incredibly convenient in the right circumstances, but not for everyone, and especially if you make less than six figures. If people want an EV, they can make that choice. In fact, they already have a number of incentives pushing them that way already. There are federal tax credits to incentivize purchasing an EV, and many states have other incentives on top of that. And they're working. A Cox survey found that 51% of consumers are now considering either a new or used EV, up from 38% in 2021. Unfortunately, this has resulted in manufacturers producing a surplus of EVs that are now sitting on lots, but businesses clearly think this is what consumers want. Otherwise, I don't think you'd see what's happening in Georgia. My home state of Georgia is positioning itself to be the electric mobility capital of the U.S. We have multiple EV and battery manufacturing facilities coming to our state, and my district specifically, that will provide thousands of well-paying jobs and prosperity. Yet Georgia has not and will not propose tailpipe rules like California or similar policies to more or less mandate EVs. I urge all my colleagues to oppose this amendment and support this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do other members wish to speak on the bill? The gentlelady from California is recognized.
Thank you. I just want to point out, if there are EVs sitting in lots, those dealers should send them to California, where there is a backlog of people who are trying to get into electric vehicles. And so, if there is, they really should be sending them to California. And I think it's short-sighted. I mean, it's short-sighted and ill-conceived to have the doctor and the pharmacist not mention at all the health impacts, because looking at health impacts, I think, is critical, and that's what this amendment is about.
Gentlelady's time has expired. You've already spoken, so I messed up by calling on you again. I apologize.
Mr. Chair, I request you...
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll yield my time to Representative Barragan.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I just to finish my remarks, you know, the citation was it's a short-sighted and ill-conceived amendment, and I think that to have a doctor and a pharmacist address the bill and not mention once the health impacts, which is what this bill is about. This is about protecting public health. What was responded to was about economic dollars, and so I just think it's short-sighted and ill-conceived that a doctor and a pharmacist won't address the health impacts, which is exactly what this is at the heart of. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I might point out that there's a public health issue associated with people not being able to get back and forth to work in places in rural communities where electric vehicles are not going to work. So I wanted to point that out too. Does anyone else wish to speak on
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield time to the good doctor here.
Thank you to the gentleman for yielding. And I think that the points have to look at the clarity of the entire situation. And as a physician, as a legislator, I realize that my constituents need to have vehicles that will get them to the doctor's office, get them to the pharmacies. They need to have reliable vehicles that will get them to the hospital. EV mandates fall greatly short, and the impact of this amendment would negatively affect not just the well-being financially of my constituents, but it would also affect their health. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the bill?
Yeah, I move to strike the last word. I, too, am a
Gentleman
physician.
from California is recognized.
I, too, am a physician, and I also studied and have a master's of public health. And when you look at public health, you look at the general health of a population. And when you look at the general health of a population, you look at all the different risk factors, and then you look at cost benefits, and you determine what is the most impactful aspect of a population's health. And I can tell you that the literature is very clear that air pollution is a contributor to chronic illnesses, to premature death, up to 10 years less of life than areas that have cleaner air. And so when we look at transportation, which it is a determinant of health when you want to be able to get from location A to B, you have to look at the entire aspect of it. So instead of arguing for one aspect of a person's health to get from point A to point B in terms of their healthcare delivery at the cost of a much bigger insult and impact to a person's health, which is breathing fumes or pollution in the air, which actually has a bigger overall impact in morbidity and mortality, we should be looking at how to incentivize cleaner vehicles, how to incentivize the population to have clean, renewable energy or cleaner vehicles with electrical vehicle charging stations in those communities. With equity in mind, equity meaning people who need them the most, like in rural areas that need the transportation, and focus on those communities, your communities, rural communities, under-resourced, underserved communities, so that they can have the benefit of both cleaner air and good, reliable transportation.
Would the gentleman yield?
All right. Sure.
I just want to point out that, once again, it's not just the public health considerations of being able to get to the point of getting access to health care. Being able to drive your automobile to and from work, to go check on grandma and grandpa who you might be responsible for, to drive the miles and miles that might be necessary in rural America to get to the grocery store, to take the kids to school. Those are issues that weigh heavy on rural Americans and contribute to an already exacerbated mental health crisis that we have in our country. So there's much more to public health. And as a public health advocate yourself, there's much more to public health than simply air pollution, although I don't deny that air pollution is something we all should be concerned about.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate those remarks, and I am a firm believer in the social determinants of health. Having good, livable wage jobs with safe neighborhoods, good green spaces, reliable electricity in your home, especially with the needs due to the extreme whiplash of weather that we're having, caused oftentimes by the fossil fuel, is very important. So again, I think that we should empower the residents to go to work, to visit their family, to visit their grandmother, to do that. It's not an either or, it's a both. And we shouldn't justify increasing pollution due to a community's lack of transportation or rural status and accept that they will just simply have to breathe the dirty air. We should work on a comprehensive plan to focus on rural America, which is my district too, in order to increase economic development in a way that fosters a cleaner air. We don't have to compromise economic development or cleaner air due to promotion of good, well-paying, livable wage transportation modalities. So that's the key point here. And this is about public health. So as a doctor and a public health specialist, I wanted to also put my 2 cents in. I appreciate that, and thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else other members wish to speak on the bill? If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment.
Mr. Chair, can we have a recorded vote, please?
A recorded vote has been called for. The clerk will call the roll.
Carter. Carter votes no. Palmer. Palmer votes no. Crenshaw. Crenshaw votes no. Joyce. Joyce votes no. Weber. Weber votes no. Allen. Allen votes no. Balderson. Balderson votes no. Fulcher. Fulcher votes no. Pfluger. Pfluger votes no. Miller Meeks. Miller Meeks votes no. Obernolte. Obernolte votes no. Rogers. Rogers votes no. Johnson.
Johnson votes no.
Johnson votes no. Tonko.
Aye.
Tonko votes aye. DeGette. DeGette votes aye. Schakowsky. Schakowsky votes aye. Sarbanes. Clark. Clark votes aye. Ruiz. Ruiz votes aye. Peters. Peters votes aye. Barragan. Barragan votes aye. Pallone. Pallone votes aye.
Are there any members not recorded? Clerk will report.
Chair Johnson, on that vote, there were 8 ayes and 12 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments? Ms. Clark is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk labeled SCD03.
The clerk will report
Oh.
the amendment.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman,
Yeah,
that'll be for the next bill, I'm sorry.
Yes, okay.
I was overzealous.
No other amendments? The question now occurs on the forwarding of H.R. 1435 to the full committee. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed?
Mr. Chair.
No.
Mr. Chair, I ask for a recorded vote, please.
A roll call vote has been called for. The clerk will call the roll.
Carter. Yes. Carter votes aye. Palmer. Palmer votes aye. Crenshaw. Crenshaw votes aye. Joyce. Joyce votes aye. Weber. Weber votes aye. Allen. Balderson. Balderson votes aye. Fulcher. Fulcher votes aye. Pfluger. Pfluger votes aye. Miller Meeks. Miller Meeks votes aye. Obernolte. Obernolte votes aye. Rogers. Johnson.
Aye.
Johnson votes aye. Tonko.
No.
Tonko votes no. DeGette. DeGette votes no. Schakowsky. Schakowsky votes no. Sarbanes. Clark. Clark votes no. Ruiz. Ruiz votes no. Peters. Peters votes no. Barragan. Barragan votes no. Pallone. Pallone votes no.
Are there members that are not recorded? How is Chair Rogers recorded?
Chair Rogers is not recorded. Rogers votes aye.
How is Mr. Allen recorded?
Mr. Allen is not recorded. Allen votes aye.
Are there other members to be recorded? Clerk will report.
Chair Johnson, on that vote, there were 13 ayes and 8 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. The chair now calls up H.R. 4468 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 4468, a bill to prohibit the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency from finalizing, implementing, or enforcing a proposed rule with respect to emissions from vehicles and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Is there any discussion on the bill? The chair recognizes Mr. Pfluger from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to work with my colleague, Mr. Wahlberg, on this. H.R. 4468, the Choice in Automobile Retail Sales Act, introduced by our full committee and sponsored by Mr. Wahlberg, is important. It's interesting that we found ourselves here, that we actually have to, once again, push back on the overreach, but we have to do it because consumer choice is going to demand it. And this legislation recognizes the importance of consumer choice in maintaining availability for the types of reliable and affordable vehicles that Americans want. As I said recently during a subcommittee hearing, we are facing an all-out assault from the EPA with rule after rule and weaponization after weaponization on liquid fuels and on primary sources of energy. These actions violate common sense. They ignore practical realities, like how much electricity will we need to make this plan work? In fact, I asked multiple senior leaders and the administrator at EPA and the Department of Energy secretary how much electricity we're going to need or currently use and how much we would need in addition to what we currently use, and nobody knows. Not a single person has been able to answer that question that's set right here in this committee. They're only concerned with imposing a mandate on how Americans live their daily lives. And the fact is that these rules will decrease our quality of life, they will jeopardize the most vulnerable in our populations, and they risk our national security by making us more dependent on nefarious actors. This must end. The CARS Act places a critical stop sign on this path to prevent a policy that makes sense for a few at the expense of the many. First, it prohibits the EPA from finalizing, implementing, or enforcing its proposal for light and medium-duty vehicles. Additionally, 4468 acknowledges that the EPA has abused its authority and did not seriously consider the impacts of its rule or if automakers can even comply. The association representing the manufacturers, which produce 97% of new cars sold in the U.S., recently announced the EPA's proposed rule is neither reasonable nor achievable in the rule's 10-year time frame. And the group listed 10 specific reasons why this rule was designed to fail, including an overly optimistic assumption about the pace and scale of EV and battery manufacturing and the technology to complement them. Additionally, the listed reasons explicitly called out that access to mined and refined critical minerals is essential and dependent on maintaining good trade relationships with China, Russia, and others who mine and refine them. This committee here, by the way, has talked about combating the nefarious actions of the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. So why would we want to embolden them and become more dependent on them? That's what this rule would do. That's why we have the CARS Act. And for good measure, there's also the lack of charging infrastructure for people who live in apartments, for those in rural and remote areas, just like my district. As if not extreme enough, the proposed rule contains unprecedented stringency in pace of growth for EVs. The rule assumes that EVs alone will make up 60% of the new vehicle sales in 2030 and 67% of new vehicle sales just 2 years later, a schedule that dwarfs President Biden's initial and ambitious 2030 target of 50%. Not only does the CARS Act send the EPA back to the drawing board, but it also amends EPA's regulatory authority to prevent us from being right back here again. Section 3 of the CARS Act prevents EPA from mandating a specific technology or issuing regulations that limit the availability of a particular vehicle engine. EPA's job is to identify emissions that danger health or welfare, not socially engineer and pick favorites in the cars that Americans must buy. If EPA intends to only set emission standards that are economically and technically feasible, this provision shouldn't be a problem. However, if EPA overreaches and decides to ratchet up greenhouse gas and criteria pollution standards to create a de facto technology or engine mandate, this bill will prevent it. H.R. 4468 is a worthy companion to the California waiver bill we are also considering, and by stunting efforts to discriminate against consumer choice and limit the mobility and freedom of Americans, it ensures and prioritizes ensuring the availability, affordability, and reliability of the vehicles and fuels that American consumers want and need for their lives. I urge everyone to use common sense and vote for this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do other members wish to speak on the bill? Ms. Schakowsky. Recognized.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
So the transportation sector is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. I, myself, personal note, choose not to contribute to that. I now am the proud owner of a GM Chevy Bolt 100% electric, a very affordable car, I might say. It has a lot of get up and go, and it's a bright, sporty red. And I appreciate it very, very much. And I'm kind of ahead of the curve here when it comes to this legislation, because the taking away of the rights of the EPA to limit emissions does not go into effect until 2027, giving plenty of time to actually meet the emissions standards. And it is estimated that the EPA program, proposed rule rather, would cut more than 7 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions, which is a important development that we should all seek. And the proposed rule is also estimated to deliver $1 trillion in net benefits by doing the following: cutting consumer costs, saving hundreds of billions of dollars in health and climate costs, making the air that we breathe cleaner and safer. So this bill would not only block the EPA's proposed light and medium duty vehicle emissions standards, but it would effectively bar the EPA from setting any future vehicle emission standards. It says it can never set vehicle emission standards. To block the EPA from setting vehicle emission standards means blocking them from fulfilling their mission, which is, and blocking them from delivering an estimated $1 trillion in benefits to consumers and to the economy. So clean air and clean environment ought to be considered by us here in the Congress as a human right. And so I strongly urge our colleagues to support this, to vote no on this very detrimental legislation, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there others wishing to speak on? Mr. Allen, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
I'd like to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Many people want to say they support electric vehicles because they want to be, they think they're cutting edge technology progressive. Interestingly, electric vehicles are not a 21st century phenomenon, and the same issues that made them unattractive to many buyers are still present today. According to Car and Driver, electric cars appeared long before the internal combustion engine, with the first non-rechargeable motorized carriage first appearing in Scotland in the 1830s. Motorized carriers with rechargeable batteries in 1859, prototype electric cars appearing in England in 1884, and a U.S. patent application for an electric carriage to a Scottish chemist living in Iowa by 1980. For reference, the Des Moines Register stated at the time that the Iowa EV had a front-wheel drive, had a top speed of 20 miles per hour, and went 50 miles on a charge. So nearly 200 years later, why haven't electric vehicles had more of a footprint in our transportation landscape, and why do states and the EPA need to ban internal combustion engines to ensure widespread EV adoption? There are two words: price and functionality. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a limited market for cars because they were expensive and only wealthy Americans could afford them. In addition, electricity was not yet widely available outside city centers, and carrying a spare battery did not make sense. Whatever benefits came to wealthier city folks from not smelling gas fumes or avoiding a noisy engine while driving were more than offset by functionality and affordability for the greater public. Consumer choice ended America's early fascination with the EV when the Ford Model T came on the scene in 1908. The Model T started at a price point that was half that of the EV, and in 15 years, the Model T cost only 10% of the price of an EV. At that time, government did not interfere and consumers won. Today, the changes EV proponents want to make to vehicles with internal combustion engines and the reasons why EV adoption is lagging are largely unchanged. The main difference between the past couple centuries and today is the government's intervention into consumer choice. No matter how much government floods the market with fleet requirements that squeeze out internal combustion engines and require EVs, if consumers aren't buying those cars, no one wins. This is why I'm supporting the CARS Act and encourage you to do as well. One size does not fit all. We heard from the Minnesota auto dealers that price and functionality are crucial to new car sales, and what makes sense for city and suburban consumers is not what people want who live in most rural areas. That's why he testified in favor of the CARS Act. The bill stops EPA's current tailpipe regulation and instead allows consumers and the market to determine the cars and engine technology they want available, not the ones that unelected bureaucrats say we should drive. I'm also supporting the CARS Act because it takes history into account and prevents people from being forced to buy technology they cannot afford or cars with engines that cannot easily be charged where they live. The CARS Act does not remove the ability for EPA to protect Americans from unhealthy vehicle emissions. It provides Americans from EPA practically limiting their options. I urge my colleagues to support the CARS Act, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do others wish to speak? Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. I strongly oppose the so-called Choice in Automobile Retail Sales Act of 2023. This bill would do nothing to expand choice in automobile sales. In fact, its ill-defined constraints on EPA's authority to address air pollution from vehicles would limit consumer choice. Congress passed and subsequently strengthened the Clean Air Act to protect public health by addressing air pollution from a variety of sources. While my Republican colleagues may not agree with the notion that EPA should be protecting public health and the environment, the Clean Air Act is the law of the land and has been for decades. Under Section 202 of the Clean Air Act, Congress directed EPA to set vehicle emission standards for a new motor vehicle. These standards were intended to drive technological innovation, which they historically have done. This bill would bar the administrator from putting in place vehicle emission standards that, quote, result in limited availability of new motor vehicles based on the type of new motor vehicle engine in such new motor vehicles, close quote. I read that as Congress telling EPA to put limits on what vehicle manufacturers can produce, and subsequently what types of cars are available for consumers to purchase. Consumers' needs should be driving what vehicle manufacturers make, and demand for EVs is astronomical. There are 45 consumers who say they would definitely buy an EV for every EV manufactured. Why should we stifle this demand? House Republicans are discounting the significant technological innovation, public health benefits, and cost savings associated with EVs in an attempt to promote their pro-oil agenda. This bill is an obvious attack on EVs, but if enacted, it would harm more than just the EV market. The vague language would apply to other vehicle types, including hybrid, flex fuel, hydrogen fuel cell, and even internal combustion engines. While I oppose this bill because of its intent, I also have significant concerns with its wide-reaching, vague language and the implications of deciding limited availability based on vehicle engine type. This bill is a step in the wrong direction, and I urge my colleagues to oppose it. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do others wish to speak on the bill? Mr. Pallone is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, Mr. Malone.
Go ahead.
Mr. Crenshaw from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I
for
move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
It's worth noting, that there's a lot of comments that make it seem like these Republican-led bills are the ones that are creating massive change, but that's not true. What these bills do is simply reverse the extreme changes proposed by the EPA. What we're proposing here is maintaining and preserving the current way of life that many Americans enjoy, and simply pointing out that there are some serious costs to these extreme changes that the EPA wants to implement. And they're looking at those costs through rose-colored glasses and not taking into account the full extent. I heard before that public health is about weighing costs and benefits. Totally agree. But you actually have to look at all the data if you're going to do that properly. And what the data suggests from the EPA's own website is that, look, if this is purely about air quality, well, air quality has increased in quality by almost 80% over the last 50 years. There isn't some air quality crisis all of a sudden. That's just false to say that. By every measure, air quality has improved drastically over the last 50 years, and it had nothing to do with EVs. The push towards EVs seems to be more about an obsession, without really any benefit to speak of. Now, there are some downsides. There is no indication that EVs are ever going to get any cheaper. They're far more expensive than combustion engine vehicles right now. They're on an uptrend, not a downtrend. Despite their more widespread use, their costs have increased. So if this is about saving the people who are in downtrodden communities, who are disenfranchised, all you're doing is making their transportation more expensive. There's also no indication that we're going to solve the problem of trying to charge these things on an already stressed grid system. Where are you going to get all the extra electricity? And we've been warned about this by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, among other grid operators. You're also not taking into account the fact that to build a single EV battery requires the mining and processing of more than 500,000 pounds of material. That's 10 times more than the roughly 25,000 pounds of petroleum that an internal combustion engine uses over the life of a car. You have to dig up 500,000 pounds of earth just to make one of these things. And you got to do it all over the world, and it's usually done with slave labor. And then it's got to be processed. And so you're emitting actually 70% more emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, to build a single EV than to build a combustion engine vehicle. 70% more. That statistic comes from the EV manufacturers themselves, who do a proper accounting of the entire supply chain. So in the short term, EVs actually increase carbon dioxide emissions. It takes about 70,000 miles for them to break even with an internal combustion engine vehicle. Those are the facts. Those are the trade-offs. If we're going to say that we're considering trade-offs, and then what's the benefit? Again, some magical health benefit? Some fixing of this air quality crisis? Look, some cities I'm sure have that air quality crisis. Then those cities should deal with it. There's ways to do that, right? If the mayor of Los Angeles wants to tax their people and buy everyone an EV, that's on you. That's not a federal government problem. That's not what we should be doing up here. We don't impose costs on the entirety of the population, on the whole of American people, just because you think there's some potential possible health benefit that you can't really articulate exactly in a couple locations. When you talk about costs and benefits and trade-offs, that's how you should talk about it, with all the facts, not just the ones you like. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Pallone, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Strike the last word to speak on the underlying bill.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I just have to say, I mean, I respect the gentleman from Texas, I really do, but I disagree with his facts and his analysis. I mean, the fact is that last week was the hottest week ever recorded. When I was home for July 4th, I read it in the newspaper. It said that July 3rd was the hottest day ever recorded. July 4th, Independence Day, was hotter even than July 3rd. So the fact is that the droughts, the wildfires, the hurricanes, extreme heat continue to rise around the country and around the world, for that matter. And the effects of these are being, felt by our constituents. They're costing us billions of dollars every year. The climate crisis is real, and the continued infusion of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere has to be addressed. I mean, those are facts. So, I know the gentleman said that it's extreme to want to change the status quo. Let's continue with the status quo. But I would say the opposite. It's not extreme. It's irresponsible, in my opinion, to continue with the status quo when faced with all these crises. There is a crisis. It's not a made-up crisis. The crisis is real. And, I mean, all you have to do is, step outside, at least where I am, or, see the kinds of problems that we're facing. So I don't think there's anything extreme. In fact, I'd say the opposite. I don't think it's responsible to act as if we can just continue with the status quo. We can't. And yes, I agree that what these bills, this bill and others do, is to try to continue the status quo, which means you continue to use fossil fuels, you continue to put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. I don't see how that's helpful. So in our efforts to try to change that, we're just doing what we think is a responsible thing for the federal government, and the federal government has the authority, in my opinion, to deal with this issue under the Clean Air Act and other legislation. But I wanted to particularly, Mr. Chairman, mention my concern with Section 2 of the bill, because Section 2 would prohibit the EPA administrator from finalizing the recently proposed multi-pollutant emission standards for model year 2027 and later light-duty and medium-duty vehicles. So these are the new standards for light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles that I believe will save consumers money, bolster our economy by promoting American manufacturing, and reduce our dependence on foreign oil. And there are significant environmental, public health, and economic benefits associated with the proposed rule. At our legislative hearing last month, we heard from EPA that the proposed standards would avoid 7.3 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions through 2055, and that between 2027 and 2055, the proposed standards' net benefits are projected to reach up to $1.6 trillion. Further, the proposed standards would save the average consumer $12,000 over the lifetime of the vehicle. That's, costs on gasoline, costs on, for the vehicles, to fix it or to keep it maintained. The proposed standards are also expected to deliver significant health benefits, including fewer cases of premature death, heart attacks, aggravated asthma, cancer, and heart disease. So, I think that my Republican colleagues are discounting these benefits, which would go unrealized if this bill were to be enacted. And with this bill, House Republicans are literally picking winners and losers. They say, we're picking winners and losers, but they're the ones that are picking winners and losers. But even if you thought that we're both picking winners and losers, the fact of the matter is, we don't want people to get sick. We don't want the climate crisis to continue. We don't want the effect of the warming of the planet to continue. And the problem is that with this bill, the winners are corporate polluters, and the losers are the American people. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on what I consider a very short-sighted piece of legislation. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members? For what purpose does Dr. Joyce seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word to speak in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized for 5
I
minutes.
yield my time to Mr. Crenshaw from Texas.
I thank the gentleman. I just want to respond briefly. So it was stated that my facts were incorrect. And I would say that the gentleman is certainly entitled to his own opinion, because that's exactly what was stated, was a series of opinions. I only stated facts, and I will repeat those facts, and they're indisputable. They're not subject to debate. They're simply facts. They're simply data and math and the science. And the facts are this: it does take 70% more emissions of carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, which you blame for climate change, right? I for one, want cleaner air. I want less carbon dioxide emissions in the world. So I look at this fact, a very hard, cold fact, and I say, how is it that we're saying that EVs are saving us from climate change by decreasing emissions, when in fact producing them produces 70% more emissions? Now, they break even eventually with an internal combustion engine vehicle at around 70,000 miles driven. Now, how long does that take? Especially considering when users of electric vehicles don't drive very far because they need charging stations, right? They're usually used in cities. So, it is a fact, and it is an indisputable fact, that in the short term at least, producing EVs and largely moving towards their use will increase global emissions of carbon dioxide. That's not an opinion. It is a mathematical fact. Now, there's been two arguments used against these bills. One is that they reduce air particulates and increase air quality at a local level. Okay, that's true, right? You don't want to breathe in what comes out of a tailpipe, and if you're breathing around an EV, sure, the air qualities might be a little bit better. But the question, of course, is, are we really in a crisis? But then the second argument that was just used is that it's going to save us from climate change, but that's just not true because of the mathematical reasoning that I just stated. It's simply not true. It is not a matter of opinion. Our opinions are the same in the need to decrease overall emissions, but if that's our goal, then the last thing you want to do is massively produce a product that has more emissions than the products we are currently using. And I yield back to my friend from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chair, we yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do other members wish to speak on the bill? Are there any bipartisan amendments?
Not that I'm aware of.
Are there any amendments to the bill?
Yes. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk labeled SCD 03.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4468, offered by Ms. Clark. Page 3, after line 12, insert the following. Section 4, certification. This act and the amendments made by this act may not take effect until the date on which the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency certifies that the implementation of this act and the amendments made...
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Republicans love to talk about the cost of electric vehicles, which I'd like to point out are expected to reach the same price point as gas-powered cars by the end of this year, thanks to the historic investments in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. However, my colleagues across the aisle failed to recognize their dire cost of inaction on reducing harmful pollution and CO2 emissions from our vehicles. That's why I'm offering this amendment, which would delay implementation of this bill until the EPA administrator certifies that it will not harm public health. I'm not sure if my Republican colleagues are aware, but passenger vehicles alone produce more than 1 million tons of nitrogen oxide emissions and over 33,000 tons of particulate matter pollution every year. Study after study have linked exposure to these pollutants with tens of thousands of preventable deaths, millions of asthma attacks, and countless cases of heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. And these emissions and their harms disproportionately impact people in low-income communities, rural communities, and communities of color. For example, one study found that light-duty gas vehicles were one of the most significant emission sources driving the disparity between communities of color in exposure to particulate matter. Reducing dangerous pollution from our vehicles is an urgent issue for the over 120 million people in the United States who live in areas with unhealthy levels of air pollution. Under the Clean Air Act, the EPA is required to address air pollution that endangers public health. My amendment simply ensures that mandate is not contradicted by ill-conceived and needlessly vague legislation. With that, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support this common sense amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. We'll now go to discussion on the amendment, and the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. And I do oppose this amendment, urge other members to do so as well. The underlying bill stops the current light-duty and medium-duty emission standards and prevents the EPA from deciding which type of cars people should be or not have available to them. It does not remove the statutory provision under Clean Air Act Section 202A1 for EPA to address air pollution that endangers public health or welfare. In addition, the amendment does not have a deadline, so EPA could never get around to making this determination, permitting EPA to effectively veto this bill. Asking the Biden EPA to make a certification that would limit its power under the Clean Air Act, recognizing the aggressive regulatory posture this administration takes, we should not give so much leeway. Also, the amendment is drafted outside of the Clean Air Act, and public health is not defined. EPA could use a definition that is consistent with the Clean Air Act, something more limited, or something much broader to justify its decision. For instance, does lack of access to an affordable and reliable vehicle decrease access to medical care or a meaningful job for people in rural areas? Finally, this amendment's conditioning of a congressional statute on executive branch action delegates Congress's Article 1 authority to the EPA. This is not in line with the separation of powers outlined in the Constitution. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing the amendment, and I will yield back my time. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? If there is no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying
Mr.
aye.
Chair, ask for a recorded vote, please.
Recorded vote has been requested. The chair will call the roll.
Carter. Palmer. Crenshaw. Crenshaw. Crenshaw votes no. Joyce. Joyce votes no. Weber. Allen. Allen votes no. Balderson. Balderson votes no. Fulcher. Fulcher votes no. Pfluger. Pfluger votes no. Miller Meeks. Miller Meeks votes no. Obernolte. Obernolte votes no. Rogers. Johnson.
Johnson votes no.
Johnson votes no. Tonko.
Aye.
Tonko votes aye. DeGette. DeGette votes aye. Schakowsky. Schakowsky votes aye. Sarbanes. Clark.
Aye.
Clark votes aye. Ruiz.
Aye.
Ruiz votes aye. Peters. Badagan. Pallone. Pallone votes aye.
Are there members that are not recorded?
Carter is not recorded. Carter votes no. Weber is not recorded. Weber votes no.
How's Mr. Peters?
Peters is not recorded. Peters votes aye.
How's Chair Rogers recorded?
Rogers is not recorded. Rogers votes. Rogers is off aye and on no.
Or any other members wish to be recorded? Clerk will report.
Chair Johnson, on that vote, there were 7 ayes and 12 noes.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 4468 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Mr. Chair, we ask for a recorded vote, please.
Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Carter. Palmer. Crenshaw. Crenshaw votes aye. Joyce. Joyce votes aye. Weber. Weber votes aye. Allen. Allen votes aye. Balderson. Balderson votes aye. Fulcher. Fulcher votes aye. Pfluger. Fluger votes aye. Miller Meeks. Miller Meeks votes aye. Obernolte. Obernolte votes aye. Rogers. Johnson.
Johnson votes aye.
Johnson votes aye. Tonko.
No.
Tonko votes no. DeGette. DeGette votes no. Schakowsky. No. Schakowsky votes no. Sarbanes. Clark.
No.
Clark votes no. Ruiz. Ruiz votes no. Peters. Peters.
No.
Peters votes no. Barragan. Pallone. Pallone votes no.
Are there other members wishing to be recorded? How's Chair Rogers recorded?
Chair Rogers votes aye.
The clerk will report.
Carter is not recorded. Carter votes aye.
Now the clerk will report.
Chair Johnson, on that vote, there were 12 ayes and 7 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. The chair now calls up H.R. 4469 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 4469, a bill to clarify that ERINs are not authorized for purposes of satisfying the volume of renewable fuel that needs to be contained in transportation fuel for purposes of the Renewable Fuel Program and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes to speak in support of the bill. I'd like to strike the last word to speak in favor of the bill. I urge support for the no fuel credits for the Batteries Act introduced by our colleague, Mr. Pence from Indiana. The legislation is straightforward. It clarifies that Congress never affirmatively gave statutory authority to the EPA to develop and use ERINs to satisfy the volume obligation for renewable fuel contained in transportation fuel under the Renewable Fuel Standard Program. The most Congress did was authorize a study and report to this committee on credits for use of renewable electricity in electric vehicles. Those study and report provisions contained in the larger Subtitle A, Title II of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, entitled Renewable Fuel Standard, appear after 5 sections that dramatically expanded the RFS and are drafted outside of the RFS provisions in the Clean Air Act. At that time, Congress could not have been clearer that any ERINs program was not meant to be a part of the RFS. Rather, Congress said, give us more information and alternatives and we'll figure it out once we have it. Since the EPA never fully complied with these requirements, how were Congress's committees of jurisdiction supposed to draft authorizing provisions for the pilot program called for in Section 206 or something more long-term? It cannot, and in fact, it did not. I know some people want to try to remake the fact pattern in a way that supports creation of ERINs. From my vantage point, though, those who want EPA to have this authority cannot get their story straight with each other. Mr. Goffman told us 2 weeks ago that the EPA's set proposal, quote, laid out a detailed approach to how a program might work under the RFS. He never testified, either in writing or orally, that the EPA had the statutory authority to implement ERINs or what that authority was. Others want to claim that EPA did what it was supposed to do under Section 206's study and report requirements the last time Congress spoke directly to the EPA, and that's enough for it to proceed. Yet, taken in the best light, EPA only partially complied. EPA's 2010 RFS rulemaking determined that it was theoretically possible for electricity to qualify as a renewable fuel and generate RINs only if the responsible party could identify the specific quantities of electricity actually used as transportation fuel. This is not practical nor feasible. But EPA, in the last 14-plus years, has not provided a report, either to this committee or to the general public, on 3 of the 4 required descriptions for alternatives based on its study. And it's changed its mind on the one it tried to accomplish. Failure to provide recommendations does not constitute either the legal authority or the excuse to act. Still others want to point to the creation of a fuel pathway and appropriations committee report language as a justification for ERIN's authority, but just creating a pathway is no guarantee of RIN authority, and report language or a joint explanatory statement is not binding in the same manner as statutory language. The facts are simple and straightforward, yet EPA left the door open to regulations creating ERINs despite its lack of authority. Mr. Goffman told us that EPA could finalize its ERINs proposal without additional notice or comment. This bill makes it crystal clear that EPA does not enjoy Chevron deference and will not survive the major questions doctrine on this matter, ensuring any action it takes to finalize ERINs will be at legal peril. I urge all members to support this bill, and I yield back. Do other members wish to speak on this bill? The gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a little ironic that the previous bill, H.R. 4468, is concerned about limiting the availability of certain types of motor vehicles. And yet with this bill, the majority seems to have no problem with limiting the availability of certain types of fuels. The concept of ERINs is not new. Since 2010, under the RFS, EPA has had approved fuel pathways for renewable electricity that is generated from eligible feedstocks. And it was not unexpected that EPA pursued operationalizing these long-approved pathways under its recent RFS set proposal. I'm very disappointed that the aspect of the rule was delayed. I do hope EPA will not be discouraged by this legislation. But as other pathways have been approved and operationalized in the meantime, the delay to act on ERINs has denied landfills, wastewater treatment plants, farmers, and other digester owners from being able to take advantage of the incentives in the program which they should otherwise qualify for. It makes no sense that a CNG for compressed natural gas bus running on renewable natural gas should qualify for credits, but an electric bus powered by electricity generated from renewable natural gas cannot. The RFS was intended to support rural communities, reduce dependence on foreign oil, and lower emissions. ERINs are clearly aligned with those goals. I do encourage members to oppose this bill and allow EPA to properly incentivize all eligible renewable fuels under the RFS, not just promote a specific type of vehicle technology. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Do other members wish to speak on the bill? Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I oppose the bill, the No Fuel Credits for Batteries Act of 2023, because if enacted, it would prohibit EPA from allowing the generation of ERINs, which we know are credits for renewable electricity generation under the Renewable Fuel Standard. It appears my Republican colleagues have forgotten the years of work that Congress, EPA, and a wide variety of stakeholders have put into this issue. To put it simply, ERINs are not a new concept. In 2010, EPA finalized a rule to allow renewable electricity to count as a renewable fuel under the RFS, as long as it was made from renewable biomass and that it was used as a transportation fuel. 4 years later, EPA approved a pathway for ERIN generation from biogas. And while the pathways were approved, EPA has yet to put in place a mechanism for ERIN generation. In 2016, EPA proposed a Renewable Enhancement and Growth Support Rule, which requested comment from stakeholders on how EPA should structure its ERIN generating mechanism. And at the end of last year, EPA put out a proposed rule with a detailed compliance mechanism structure for ERINs. We heard from EPA that the ERIN proposal received such extensive feedback that the agency chose to further engage with stakeholders before finalizing. So in addition to over a decade of regulatory action, Congress has explicitly directed EPA to continue working on eRINs. In fact, in 2020, Congress appropriated funds for EPA to process applications for the electric pathway under the RFS. Now, with this bill, my Republican colleagues are simply turning a blind eye to decades of regulatory action, congressional direction, and stakeholder engagement on eRINs simply because they are opposed to electric vehicles. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill. It really makes no sense to stop all this progress. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Do other members wish to speak on the bill? Gentlelady from Iowa, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Wish to speak in support of the bill.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. As a state that has some of the highest production of biofuels, be it ethanol, be it biodiesel, be it compressed natural gas, and 50% of our energy in the state of Iowa is from renewables, I strongly support this. The RFS and eRIN concept was not meant to have electricity generated from an electric vehicle, even if that electric vehicle is produced by using biofuels that create electricity. So I think that not having this bill in place allows electric vehicles to supplant a marketplace that is large and is growing and is needed, especially as we look at future markets with sustainable aviation fuel and marine fuel. So I'm strongly in support of this bill. I yield.
Gentlelady yields back. Do other members wish to speak on the bill? Are there any bipartisan amendments? Are there any amendments? Since there are no amendments, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 4469 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye.
Mr. Chair, I ask for a recorded vote, please.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Carter. Aye. Carter votes aye. Palmer. Crenshaw. Crenshaw votes aye. Joyce. Joyce votes aye. Weber. Weber votes aye. Allen. Allen votes aye. Balderson. Balderson votes aye. Fulcher. Fulcher votes aye. Pfluger. Pfluger votes aye. Miller Meeks. Miller Meeks votes aye. Obernolte. Obernolte votes aye. Rogers. Johnson.
Johnson votes aye.
Johnson votes aye. Tonko.
No.
Tonko votes no. Degette. Degette votes no. Schakowsky. Schakowsky votes no. Sarbanes. Clark. Clark votes no. Ruiz. Ruiz votes no. Peters. Peters votes no. Barragan. Pallone. Pallone votes no.
Are other members needing to be recorded? How is Chair Rogers recorded?
Chair Rogers is not recorded. Rogers votes aye.
The clerk will report.
Chair Johnson, on that vote, there were 12 ayes and 7 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Without objection, entering into the record, the article, unsold electric cars are piling up on dealer lots, the Axios article. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the subcommittee today. That is so ordered. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Good job, Mr. Chairman.